Patreon. Did Jesus Exist series. We are Myth Vision. Did Jesus Exist with Dr. Robert M. Price. One of the biggest, mysteries we find in the Pauline epistles, if those who take the 7 as authentic and the others as possibly pseudo-Paul or something, is that Paul never quotes Jesus for words that Jesus himself says. There's no quotes from the Gospels that we have, that supposed sayings of Jesus himself. Doesn't that work in line with mythicism? And what does that say about who Paul's Jesus was? Or can we delve into this topic of why doesn't he just quote him?
Yeah, wouldn't you think that would be the way to settle things? Corinthians, there's your view, and then there's the opinion of the Son of God. That would kind of settle it, I should think. But does he ever quote Jesus? There's a couple of places where people say that he does, with attribution. Let's leave it at that for a second. This I say to you by the word of the Lord. I think it's one of the Thessalonians, I forget. And the Lord himself will descend with the shout, the trumpet, the archangel, and this and that and the other thing. Actually, if you read my book, The Paperback Apocalypse, I deal with this. It's not clear that he means the Lord Jesus, because I reproduce a lengthy passage from one of the prophets of the Old Testament, of which the Pauline text appears to be a kind of a précis, a condensation, just picking out certain phrases he wants to emphasize, like we would do with the ellipse dots. And so you really have to wonder, is he talking about the Lord Jesus or the Lord Jehovah? And I think it's a pretty good case that this is not my original observation. But I think that really is off the table there. The one people like is best to quote is in 1 Corinthians 7, where he says, he's talking about divorce, and he says, I say not the Lord. About this I have no saying from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who is deemed worthy. And if the man divorces his wife, etc., etc., well, okay, where did he get this from the Lord? Is it a quoted source? Is it something Jesus said, or is it something he's saying now? You cannot cavalierly dismiss the latter when you read something like the 7 letters to the churches in the book of Revelation, where the Son of God, whose eyes are as a flame of fire, says to the church at Laodicea and all that. I just don't see how that is not at least as likely that, what is Paul talking about in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14? When you come together, one has a word of wisdom, one has a word of knowledge, you prophesy. From whom? It's hilarious to see people try to explain this in some other way. Like Calvin said, I believe, that prophesying, well, that just means preaching the gospel. No, it doesn't. Come on, stop twisting the text. It must be the word of the Lord from the heavenly Christ. And then he says he says, this I say, not the Lord. But then he says, this I say by the word of the Lord. If you take a look at the context, when he's saying, okay, I don't have a command of the Lord, but I think I'm trustworthy, he's dealing with an ambiguous issue. It's not clear cut. And that's why he says, I have to, give you my best thought about it. Whereas the other one, it's pretty darn clear, and so he can speak with Christ's authority, and he probably got it from the man upstairs, just like in Galatians. I didn't get my gospel from anybody, nor was I taught it. It came as a revelation from the Lord. I don't see, and then later on, if this is an integral part of the text, what does he say at the end of chapter 14? If anybody considers himself a prophet, let him recognize that what I am writing is a command of the Lord. That kind of erases the possibility that, see, I remember Jesus when he was at Caesarea Philippi once said, there's no statement like that. Now you can look at Romans chapter 12, which is filled with nifty sayings like, do not be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. And it sounds kind of like stuff you would hear in the Sermon on the Mount, though you don't, but it sounds similar. Why doesn't he say, Jesus said? You'd think that would settle the issue. Why? And this is of a piece with the fact that he never mentions Jesus having performed any miracles. He doesn't talk about Jesus being a teacher. When he talks about the crucifixion of Jesus, it's spooky. He says, if whoever wrote Colossians says that he was done in by the principalities and powers. And in 1 Corinthians, the archons of this age crucified him, though they wouldn't have done it had they realized what they were doing. They're signing their own death warrants. The archons of this age, the rulers of this age, could that be Herod and Pilate and all that? Well, yeah, it could, because they did have the belief that the fallen angels were the powers behind the thrones of the nations. Could be, but why does he skip over saying that? Why does he just say that the powers crucified him themselves? Because if they did, then you're talking about the heavenly Christ, how the sacrifice that saves and gave life to the world was like that of Purusha in the Rig Veda, when his body, which he allowed to be severed and dismembered, it became all the different things in the world, or similar stuff with, another example is slipping my aged brain now. But it begins to make you wonder, if he mentions no historical circumstances, maybe he didn't think there were any. Again, like you have to consider what it says in Romans 13 and in 1 Peter, where it says, hey, now you be good citizens, because we know God has given the power of the sword to the government and to the emperor, and he doesn't punish the righteous, only the wicked. Could you possibly say this if you knew about the Pilate story? What on earth?
Dr. Price, I wanted to mention something, because Paula Fredrickson, and she runs with Christine Hayes, right? I recently was actually blown away. I had to write Dr. Carrier on this, because I was like, ooh, this is interesting. These are historicists to the core. They don't go to mythicism. This is, mainstream, but not mainstream as in Bible believing mainstream. These are Jewish scholars. They write on Old Testament, New Testament. She made the argument that the gods run in the blood, or as it's phrased, gods run in the blood, or why Paul's pagans were not converts, right? She does this very good lecture, and in it she talks about Paul arguing, or making a case here, on the archons of this age, or the aeons, etc., that these were the gods, she says, the gods or daemons that were fighting Paul. So the same battle that Jesus has experienced with these daemons, these archons, Paul's having, issues with. And according to her, she says, when she says that the gods run in the blood, the nations that according to her are non-Israel are ruled by other gods, and it's this idea that Paul's battling these other gods by going and bringing his gospel to them, telling them, stop worshiping your gods, come worship, his God, and we'll get into who that God was at some further time, or what's Paul doing. It's important, though, you can't divorce the people necessarily from the God. Is that a case for historicity, or is that a case for what you're saying? And I think what's important in what you're saying here is the battle's spiritual. So to say this is a historical Christ, not saying there couldn't have been, it would be easier. Paul could have made more references, I think. He could have been a little more clear instead of it just being spiritual, like the way he's approaching it. She's saying these are other gods, demons, so to speak, that he's battling. And I thought to myself, well, are the aeons of this age the Romans? Are the aeons of this age the Jews? If you look at the Gospels, you'll find children of the serpent, children of the devil, are these the Jews? Well, the Jews, it wouldn't make much sense to say that they're the ones who technically are being ruled by these false gods. Is Paul pulling from an ancient idea in Genesis? And Paula, as well as other scholars like her, say Paul's reaching way back in his pocket, back where the sons of God took daughters of men, these narratives, and where the Babel takes place and the tongues are separated, which is what we start to see. They got gifts. Well, what's going on? Unification of the nations that have been taken over in different jurisdictions by different gods. And here is Paul taking back what once was his God's stuff. So I'm with you. My thing is, and this kind of segues into why Paul's not referencing any type of historical quote by Jesus, but maybe this is another question. People cry at the whole idea. They think it's ridiculous to think Jesus was crucified in the heavens. Show me a reference if it says he died in the first heavens, or the only thing we have is we get these really beautiful, loud-speaking Gospels, and they really overshadow what Paul's saying in a lot of ways, so sometimes we let that, I guess, rush its way into Paul's thinking. What gives you the idea that this is a heavenly Jesus? I know the aeon argument you just made, but you see where I'm going with this?
Well, it seems to me it's the same problem if he, like when he says or whoever wrote Ephesians, said we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers in heavenly places and so on. Keep in mind, if he wrote 2 Corinthians, he actually has a story where he ascends to the third heaven and is beaten with the fist, kolaphizo, by an angel of Satan. There's no politics involved there. And he appeals to the enthroned Lord that it might pass from him, and he says, my grace is all you need. And he says, well, okay, in that case, I'll rejoice in all the persecutions and so on, which, of course, he's thinking of the human agents of Satan. We are not ignorant of his devices, he says in Thessalonians. The fact that he doesn't make a reference, even in Ephesians, to some governmental powers or anything, and he does in 2 Corinthians refer to an assault in heaven on him, makes me think it's still a very viable thing. How are does he mention intermediaries in any of the cases? I don't know. He does say in 1 Corinthians, where he's telling them not to participate in idol sacramental feasts, he says that we all know that the gods the Gentiles worship are demons. That was part of Hellenistic Judaism. And of course the fallen angels and the sons of God were identified with one another, and they were the power behind the throne, as in Daniel. Was it Michael or Gabriel says to Daniel, I'm sorry I'm late, but I was held up fighting the king of Persia. What is that? Well, he means the false god who runs Persia.
Wow.
And but he's having a fight in heaven with him. So I don't think you can knock off that celestial crucifixion thing.